Okay, today is, excuse me, part one of what I hope will be a 5-part series, a 5-part mini-series about different behemoths and chayas. Just for the structure of it, today is going to be somewhat of an introduction and overview. Then the plan is to have 3 times of going through specific animals, and then the last time would be sort of wrapping up and covering some issues having to do with behemoths and chayas as well. Also, before I start, Mrs. Bironit Cohen, who's the manager of the CRC's Southeast Regional Office, did a lot of work towards the research to figuring out the information you're going to be hearing about in the next 5 times. Okay, so let's see what we're going to talk about. The Torah in 2 places tells us that we could tell which animals are kosher by if they have split hooves and they chew their cud. And in Devarim, when it says that, it says there are 10 kosher animals. It says, Zois habahema asher techelu, shar, sei ksavim, sei izim. Those are 3. The next pasuk, ayil, utzvi, v'yachmor, v'akoy, v'dishain, us'oy, v'zomer, another 7 animals. Now, so the Torah says there are 10 kosher animals. Now, if we look around in nature, you'll see that you'll find out that there are dozens of animals that have both signs of being kosher. They have split hooves and they chew their cud. So, obviously, excuse me, the 10 animals that are listed here are not 10 animals, but they're 10 categories or 10 species of animals that are kosher. Just as an example of it, to help you just to connect to that, is the Gemara in Chulin is unsure whether a certain animal, it's called Easy Debala, not sure if it's a behem or a chaya, and says, well, maybe it's part of Akoy, or maybe it's Sa'oy or Zomer. Those are the 3 last animals in the pasuk. In other words, this animal is not one of the 10 listed, but it's within those groups. Okay, each group is going to include other animals as well, and therefore maybe this animal, this Easy Debala, is one of those animals. Is going into one of those groups. So we're gonna in the next 3 times, not today. In the next 3 times, we're gonna look at those 10 animals, and we're gonna try to figure out what they are. What are the 10 animals Torah is talking about, and then the features or characteristics that they have that makes it into a species. And then if we could figure out what it is that's unique or what identifies them or what's particular to that animal, then we could figure out other animals. And when we come across another animal, say, which group does it fit into? Okay, and a side benefit of all this discussion of trying to figure out which animals are kosher, which kosher animals are these 10 animals, is going to help us understanding certain horns, whether they are or not kosher to be used as a shofar for Rosh Hashanah. There are nafkaminas, whether an animal is a behem or a chaya, halachic nafkaminas, and the Gemara tells us different ways of figuring out which animals are a behem or a chaya, and that's going to be in the very last part, in the 5th part of when we talk about it. Okay, now we're going to make our identification of these animals, etc., and their features based on words from Chazal or hints from the Chazal, Rishonim, Poskim, and things like that, and that will directly translate what a word means, or give us a clue that helps us figure out something about what an animal is. So, for example, there's some of the sources we'll use for those things are the Targum HaShivim, the Septuagint, Reb Sadia Gaon's Pirush HaChumash, and the Chizkuni, both of those in Devarim. And a lot of times the words that they use don't mean anything to me. I don't speak French or Aramaic. Or Arabic. But Rabbi Ari Kaplan and Rabbi Yosef Kapach, who both translated these works, who could tell us what did they have in mean, what did they mean in using a more modern word that we can understand it. Now, just bear in mind that this Septuagint it's a Greek translation written by Chazal. It's the Targum HaShivim. It's seemingly the Targum HaShivim, and it's just worth bearing in mind that the Targum HaShivim was not controlled by Jews, and it's not really so sure how much what we have today is the original or how much it was tampered or edited over the generations. And there's one most obvious glaring change, which is the Targum HaShivim is only on Chumshei Torah. But the Septuagint, it's got a translation of Nach also, so that's obviously somebody else added that in that wasn't from, so to speak, the original. So we take it for what it's worth. Okay, what we will not do is follow the path of scholars who have this idea that the Torah only tells us about animals that were available in Eretz Yisrael at the time when the Torah was given. I don't see anything in the Poskim that makes me think that should be correct. And it's just used as a way to excuse questions, or to say, I could be for sure this is this animal because those other choices that you might have weren't available at the time when the Torah was given. So I don't see that in Poskim. And also, the Gemara says that you should know the fact that the Torah lists all the kosher animals and says these are the only kosher animals must be that it was written by Hashem, because who else would know all the animals that are on earth? Okay, so in other words, that's telling us is this list is meant to be comprehensive. It's not meant. There aren't supposed to be animals that are not listed. Okay, that just even if they weren't available right in that time, and so in other words, when the Torah lists us these 10 animals, it even includes animals, the okapi we're going to see about from the Congo, and the swallow from Vietnam, and other animals that nobody discovered until quite recently. Okay. Also, the Gemara says a little bit in a different place in Chulun, the Gemara says is that the Rebbe showed Moshe Rabbeinu all the kosher and non-kosher animals, so he would know what people could eat and what he couldn't eat, which is very straightforward, straight out telling us that it didn't only depend on what was available right at the time. Hashem showed him all the animals and said to him, "This is what you could eat. This is what you could eat. This is what you can't eat." Okay, now, it's part of our mitzvah, I'll say, of Talmud Torah to figure out as much as we can about everything I said until now. But we're going to see ourselves that Chazal themselves were not for sure about all this information. For example, there's a Mishnah that has a machlokes whether a sharabar, which is a kosher animal, is it a behemoth or is a chaya? And the Tosefta and the Yerushalmi say that part of that question of whether it's a behemoth or a chaya is the sa'oi, is it part of the sa'oi, which is the ninth of the animals in the Torah? So there's a machlokes whether ta'oi includes this animal or not. And then that ends up as a machlokes whether it's a behemoth, whether a sharabar is a behemoth or a chaya. So Chazal themselves weren't sure about that. And then the other animals, the Gemara is not sure about whether certain animals were behemoths or chayas. And the Gemara says, like I mentioned before, were they sa'oi, or was it akka, was it zomer? I mean, the chayas. So the Gemara is not sure what they belong to. And Rashi says the people, the Chazal didn't know, they weren't familiar with these animals. So they said, maybe this animal that I'm holding is a sa'oi or a zomer. I don't know what a zomer is, but maybe this is what it is. Who knows? There's a question. Taisa says a Kashrus. So why didn't they just look at the horns? We're going to talk about at some point that there are horns, that you could use horns to identify whether an animal is kosher or treif. Taisa says they couldn't tell. That was the point. They couldn't tell using those signs what it was. Okay, so all this tells us the Chazal themselves were not sure how to identify all these kosher animals. And of Mamela, we're not going to be that much better off. So we know going into this that we're not going to get to the end of the question, but as we say, we're not going to finish the malacha. But we have to do what we can to understand what we can, knowing good and well that we're not smarter than Chazal. We're not anywhere near going to get to the point of knowing everything, but we'll see what we could figure out. Okay, next point. Chazon Ish says, as relates to fruits and vegetables, the decision which fruits are in the same min or not, as relates to klayim, there are certain things that can't be mixed together if they're from different minim. So he says the way you decide what's a min that they should all be together versus a not min that they can't be together depends on certain physical features like the shape of the leaves of the tree or the appearance of the fruit and even the nutritional value of the fruit. Okay, and he says another thing. He says if the same tree will produce different fruit depending on where you plant it, like which climate you plant it in, that's considered one min, even though the fruits end up being different. Okay, so he doesn't tell us how you should know. He's talking about climate in fruits and vegetables. He doesn't tell us how to do this for animals, but presumably it's some kind of a similar idea. We look at features that we could see to decide which animals are one min and which ones are not the same min. The Chazon mentions that there's an element of Ruach HaKodesh in this. But even so, there's some kind of a way of figuring out, looking at the features of in our case, the animal, to try to understand which ones are one min or not. And we can see the same idea that the Chazon Ish is saying in the Gemara, the way the Gemara talks about birds. The Gemara says that in the East, I guess that means like the Far East, there are 100 types of birds that are all considered part of the bird called Aya, which is not kosher. It's one of the 24 birds that Torah says is not kosher. So the Gemara says, that so there are 24 non-kosher birds, and those 24 birds are obviously not just 24 birds. There's 100 birds that are ayah, so there's more than 24. So obviously that means is that there are 24 species. Okay, so then now we have a question. The Gemara says that if a person could identify all 24 non-kosher birds, then he could eat any birds that he finds. If he finds a bird, he walks across the street, he finds this bird in the street, he could eat it. If he knows it's not he knows all 24. It's not one of those, he could eat it. So how could he eat it? Maybe it's not one of those 24. Maybe it's part of their species. Maybe this is one of the 100 that belong into Aya, or presumably the other ones have species also. The answer is, part of saying I know all 24 birds is that I can look at a bird and I could know who's in his species also. Like if I see a bird that has a white feathers and I find another one that has brown, I know if just having a little bit of different colored feathers is enough to tell me it isn't the same inn or it's not in the same inn. And so therefore, when I come across a bird, if I go to the Far East and I find these 100 birds, I'll know that they're part of Aya. So the same thing. So this part of the chachma or the knowledge of knowing the birds is to know what makes them be part of a species or not part of a species. Okay, and the same thing's for animals. We have these 10 kosher animals, and there's going to be a way to know which ones are. What's the feature that says, oh, this is what makes it a species, that we can find other ones that will be like it. That'll be like it. Okay, our next thing is like this. Most people, the way we talk is that anything that comes out of an animal's head, we call a horn. Okay, that's what we say. We call everything a horn. And in Lashon Kodesh, it seems like that's what the Torah would call a keren. Okay, a keren means something that pops out of the animal's head. Okay, now we'll see later in one of the future times that for a shofar, maybe there are other words that are not exactly keren, but by and large, the word keren means something that pokes out of the animal's head, and this pokey thing that comes out of his head. But in English, there are 3 different types of horns, of these protrusions. Okay, and I'm going to mention what they are because we're going to see that they actually seemingly are going to play a role in determining which animals belong to which meaning. Okay, and the 3 terms are, I'm going to say them first and then explain them: horn, antler, and ossicone. Okay, what's a horn? A horn is, this is English, so we're going to explain what in English what that word means. A horn means it's bone, like the center of the horn is bone, covered by something called keratin, which is what your fingernails are made out of. Okay, and usually animals in most cases, are not born with horns, and they develop as the animal gets older, as it grows. If you cut off a horn, it doesn't grow back, and they almost are never branched. Okay, you're just one point. Now, there's a thing called a pronghorn, which has a prong at the end, so it's a little bit of a branch, and they actually grow back every year, but that's like an unusual exception. Okay, usually horns are more common with male animals than with females, and when females do grow horns, typically they're much smaller and less curled than the horns of males of that same species. Okay, their horns are on cows, sheep, goats, gazelles, antelopes, and many other kosher animals. Okay, those are horns. Now, antlers. Antlers are not the same as horns. They are bony, branched, we'll call them structures, which are covered with something called velvet, which is like a skin and a soft, furry hair. The animals shed their antlers every year, and in some animals, when it grows back the next year, it grows back even larger and sometimes even more branched than the previous years. Antlers, as a rule, are only present in the male animals, except for reindeer or caribou. It's the same thing. Reindeer that have it also in the females. So antlers are on deer, elk, moose, muntjac, and reindeer. Okay, those have antlers. They don't have horns. They have antlers. Okay, again, if you saw it in the zoo, you might say, "Oh, that has horns," but technically, it's called an antler. Okay, and the last group is called Ossicones, and these are these short. I'm reading you a translation from the Webster Dictionary. Short, conical, or columnar protuberances on the head of male and female giraffes and male okapis that are composed of ossified cartilage covered by skin and hair. As ossicones enlarge and ossify, they become fused to the skull. So there's these things that poke out on the top of a giraffe. If you ever look at a giraffe, you see at the top of its head, it's got these 2 things poking out of it. They're not terribly large. And okapis, the males have them as well. They are made from ossified cartilage. I guess that's why they're called ossicones, and they're covered by skin in here. And they eventually become attached to the skull, and they become like a permanent part of the skull. Okay. Now, you only have ossicones that we know are on giraffes and okapi. Antlers and ossicones grow on so few animals. Again, most animals have what we in English would call horns, and antlers and ossicones are so unusual that, in fact, we will see that they may actually be the defining feature of that animal. Now, the inner bone of a real horn, meaning a horn like on a goat. Okay, if you take the horn of a goat, so I said it has bone in the center, a core of bone covered with keratin. If you excuse me, you could remove that bone. Okay, you can get it out. However the process is, you can get it out, and leaving the keratin by itself, and then you can blow that. You can make that keratin into a shofar. That's what we use as a shofar. Okay. Antlers and ossicones are solid. They don't have a core with an outer layer. There's nothing, you can't pull out the center and leave something else, and therefore they cannot be used. Excuse me. That you cannot use them. You cannot use them as a shofar. Okay, so you can only use horns as shofar. You can't use antlers and you can't use ossicones. Now it happens to be that the Mechaber brings that the Ramban says that the keren, the karnaim of most chayas are solid and can't be used, and therefore can't be used as a shofar. In other words, since they're solid, they don't have a center you can pull out. They can't be used as a shofar. Now, what we would say, if we were saying that in English, we would say is most chayas have antlers, and they don't have horns, and therefore you can't use it as a shofar because you can only use a horn as a shofar, not an antler. Okay. Now, it happens to be that in practice there are more species that have horns than antlers. The Ramban saying there are more species that have antlers than horns, but really there are more horns than antlers. And presumably, what the Ramban means is where he lived, there were more chayas walking around that had antlers, meaning there were more deer than there were ones with horns, like antelopes. Okay, they were just in practice there were more of this than that. It didn't mean that in my separations there were really more of these. Okay, now there, in addition to what I just mentioned, horns, antlers, and ossicones, there are other horn-like items that stick out of the head of animals. Okay, but not from the top like what we think of as a horn. It's not clear if in Lashon Kodesh those are considered a keren also. So, like for example, there's tusks and fangs, which are really elongated teeth that grow out of an animal's mouth, like on an elephant or a walrus or a warthog. Those are all not kosher. Or on a musk deer or a chevrotain, those are kosher animals. Okay, so are those considered keren also in Lashon Kodesh? In English, we don't call them horns, but maybe in Lashon Kodesh they are. They poke out of the animal like that. Now, different from that is a rhinoceros has a horn, but it grows out of the front of its snout instead of the top of its head. And it's made completely out of keratin. Okay, so all of these things that I just mentioned, all these protrusions that are not clear if they're keren or not, they're not hollow. So for sure they're not kosher for shofar. Whether they're technically a keren in Lashon Kodesh, I don't know. Okay, now species that have horns, there will be animals that are genetically born. They are polled, which means they're not going to grow horns. That specific animal, I mean, all goats grow horns, but some goats just don't. And also, it's a lot of cases that the females don't have horns, or if they do, they're much smaller than the males are. Like for example, the ram is a well-known animal. It's a male sheep that's at least 12 months old, and it gets these corkscrew-shaped horns. Okay, but a ewe, I think that's how you pronounce it, is a female sheep that's the same age, and either they have no horns or they have like little cutie ones that are not nearly as dramatic as the ram's horns are. Okay, an exception for antlers, as I said, only males have antlers except for reindeer / caribou, where the females also. And in ossicones, the male giraffes are larger than the females, and female okapi don't really have them. They just have a bump. Okay, we're going to see. I'm not going to go through the different types of horns for now. Maybe we'll talk about it when we get to their places. The difference between the horns of one animal and the next could be so dramatic that we're going to find out. It seems to me that may be the defining feature to make one min over the other. It has that special horn. That in itself is the defined feature. Like, for example, the branching of certain antlers for certain animals might be what makes them into a min. We'll see when we get to there. Okay? Now, it seems what one thing about all these types of horns and antlers and the whole work, antlers, ossicones, is it seems they're only there in kosher animals. That's what it seems like from all the animals that we looked at. And we found it seemed like every one of them that had a horn, again, it seemed like it was kosher. Now, I told you beforehand, okay, we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so now the reason why I say it seems, or I'm not saying that with confidence, is because, first of all, a couple of reasons. First of all, is the Tosefta has a machlokes whether an animal that has horns needs to have to check its hooves to see if it's kosher. It could be just seeing a horn. If the simple reading of the Tosefta is brought in the Gemara, simple reading is that Reb Doisa says is that if it has a horn, it's automatically it's kosher. Just having a horn is automatically means it's kosher, of course. But there's a machlokes. The other man, the Yom says, no, you have to check further. Just checking the horn is not enough. That's one thing. And also Taisa says it's not even so clear that Reb Doisa really said that. Did Reb Doisa really mean that? Maybe he only meant that it had certain types of horns. Then it's kosher. That's one thing. Second is, I already told you that rhinoceroses have this thing poking out of their snout that sort of looks like a horn. Rhinoceroses are not kosher. So if that's considered a horn, then we just found an animal that's not kosher that has horns on it. And elephants have these things that a scientist would say is a tooth. It's a long tooth, but maybe someone would think that a horn. I'm not really sure about that. Okay. And the last is that although all the animals that we know of so far, okay, I forgot to mention there are non-animals that have horns. Like there are fish. There's a narwhal fish that has a horn, and a kind of reptile, a Jackson's camelon, I don't know how to pronounce it, and horned viper is kind of a snake. I don't know whether those would be good as shofars, but they all have horns on them. Those are not kosher. They're not animals, really. They look a little different, Anyhow, last is that all the animals that we are aware of that have horns seem to be kosher. But the truth is that scientists every so often find new animals that they never heard of beforehand. I mentioned some of these already in passing. The okapi were found in the Congo in 1901, and chevrotains were found in Southeast Asia in 1910, and sawala were found in Vietnam in 1992. Now, all those were kosher. It happens to be all those were kosher. But I don't know what they're going to find tomorrow in the middle of who knows where. They're going to find another one. So that's why I qualified by saying it seems like all the ones that have horns are kosher. And what all this finding new animals doesn't reflect on Reb Doisa. Reb Doisa was just saying is in practice, if you walk around the street and you find an animal with a horn, then Ken said that's going to be kosher. Okay, also, scientists believe that dinosaurs, some of them, whole groups of them, had horns. I have no idea, of course, whether dinosaurs are kosher and whether they even existed. I guess they seem to have existed, and they seem to have horns. So are they kosher? Beats me. No idea. Now, the idea that there's an animal can have horn. There could be horns on a non-kosher animal. Comes up in Hilchos Rosh Hashanah. Okay, the Ramah says that if you make a shofar from a non-kosher animal, you can't use it on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, you can't use that kind of a shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Now the Baragorla says but the Mishnah says sort of like Reb Doisa that you only find horns on kosher animals. So what's going on? How are you going to find a horn on a non? How could he say horns on a non-kosher animal are not kosher for a shofar when there's no such thing? What is he talking about? So, now they weren't talking about. He for sure wasn't talking about rhinoceroses or other animals that I mentioned in the past, the non-kosher animals, because those for sure can't be used as a shofar. As I mentioned, they're solid. There's no way you can't. Those are not kosher as a shofar for a different reason. So, what did the Rambam mean? That when he said non-kosher animals' horn can't be used as a shofar. So the Baragorla comes up with a case based on the din in your day and Siman Ayin Tes of a Tmea that gave birth to a Kosher, a whole kinds of animal, a whole kinds of thing. Maybe we could come up with a situation, or the Rambam is maybe just saying something theoretical. Okay, just a theoretical point. In theory, if there would be such a thing, but again, that makes the point that even though it appears to us that all the kosher animals, all the animals with horns are kosher, it may in fact not be true. Okay, there's such a possibility. Okay, so this is the end of our part one, just a sort of introductory and overview of some of these things. The next three parts of the plan is we'll do a couple of the animals of the 10 that are listed, go through each one of them, and then the last part of Mitzvah Shem will be to talk about some questions about chayes and behemoths and some other related issues to summarize.